So are you new to using Lightroom? Well, in this video today, I'm going to be going through the basics on how to touch up your images. Let's get right to it. What's up, everybody? My name is Josh Cannon. I am a photographer based out of Richmond, Virginia. And today I wanted to put this video together to walk you through my steps and my workflow when editing images in Lightroom. This isn't going to be a full in-depth tutorial, but I just wanted to show you all the basics of what I use when I'm editing an image from a RAW file all the way up to a JPEG and be able to send it off either to a client or put it into Photoshop. I'm going to put timestamps below explaining each step in the process as I go about editing this picture here. So if you want to follow along, you can do that, as well as I will be including a raw image for you all to practice on your own. So the first thing that I typically like to do is go down the list of my sliders here on the right hand side. As you can see, we have exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So I typically like to start with my shadows just to see where I can find a good balance point on my image. As you can see, as I boost up the shadows, the background does come to life a little bit. It's pretty blurred out because I was shooting this at an aperture of 1.4 to really make sure my subject stood out from the background, as well as the foreground that you see here with this brick wall. After I boost up my shadows, that's when I'll go to my blacks, just to make sure that everything is balanced, and then I will boost that as well. The most important thing to remember is that you want to go in small increments. A lot of times when people first get started in Lightroom, they usually will move everything all the way to the right or either all the way to the left. But the key is to make sure that you move in small increments. If you click on the eye at the top of the corner here, this will actually toggle on what you've done so far. So as you go, you should make sure that you're checking to see if you like the edits that you've done or if you don't like the edits that you've done. So once I've gone and adjusted my shadows and my blacks, then I will move on to my exposure. So the exposure, you definitely want to go into small increments because you don't really want to have your image super blown out, or you don't want to have it too bright where it gives almost like this dreamy effect. I'm the type of photographer, I like to typically shoot my images a little bit on the darker and contrasty side. I'll make some small adjustments to my shadows as needed, and then I will bring down my highlights just a tad. Next thing I'm going to do is to boost up my contrast. Remember, you want to go into small increments, not too much, just to add enough to really give contrast between your subject and the background. Once again, we'll check where we came. This is where we started. This is after. This is where we started. And this is after. Next, what you can do is play with your curves adjustment layer. So your curves adjustment layer is there to allow you to adjust your highlights, your midtones, and your shadows. And when you're adjusting that, that's how you do it. You can make a point in the center, and that is going to adjust the overall midtones. So when I'm in Lightroom, typically that's all I'm going to adjust. So I'll boost up my midtones just a little bit, and with her skin complexion, I do want to keep that contrast. So I'm going to draw a dot or click a dot right here in my shadows. I'm going to bring that down just a little bit, and as you can see, that brings out her skin complexion, the shadows in her hair, and it gives more of that 3D pop. The next step, I'm going to move down into my color section. As you can see here, we have temperature, tint, vibrant, and saturation. So temperature, of course, makes the image either cooler or lighter. So if I move the slider to the left, it's going to have more of that icy feel. If I move it to the right, it's going to have more of that warm feel. So I had my camera set to auto white balance, so I kind of like my white balance where it is right there, but I'm just going to boost it just a little bit to add more warmth. The vibrance is usually the next step that I'll go, and I'll boost that just a little bit as well. Once again, we're going to check where we started to where we came. So this is before adding color. This is after. Before, after. So typically my next thing I'll look at is the skin complexion. if you boost your oranges, that's typically where most people's skin complexion is going to lie. So if I move it to the right all the way and exaggerate that, of course, you'll see that her skin is very, very orange, and we don't want anybody to look like an Oompa Loompa. If I go all the way to the left, it's going to take out all of the color in her skin complexion, and then she's going to have that dead corpse look, and we don't want that either. So what I'm going to do next is to go back to my center point being 0, and then just boost it just a touch and lift up my luminance. So just to break down to you all the difference between hue, saturation, and luminance, also known as your HSL slider. Hue adjusts the overall color. So we can make our oranges more orange. We can make our oranges less orange, and they'll start to shift to other colors. If I'm talking about saturation, that's how rich the actual color is. The luminance is actually brightening the color. So when I'm doing my adjustments, I don't really mess too much with the hue when we're talking about skin complexion, but I will boost my saturation just a little bit, as well as my luminance, so that way I can bring some life back to the skin complexion. The next thing that I'm going to move to is going to be my color grading. So like we spoke earlier, you have the different sections of light within an image. You have your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. If you look at your color grading, we have our 3 circles here. One adjusts shadows, the other midtones, and the other is highlights. So if I move this little dot in the center and drag it to the left, you'll notice that my shadows will actually start to become more blue. If I move it to the right, up to the top, you'll see that my shadows become more orange. So I like to typically add a hint of red to my images. That's just my editing style. And then my midtones, I will leave that alone. My highlights, I will leave that alone. So once again, we can check what we've done so far. Before, after, before, after. So my next step, this is very important to anybody that plans to post anything onto Instagram or any other social media platform. You want to make sure that you crop your image to the right aspect ratio. When you're posting an image to Instagram and the image is portrait mode, you want to make sure that your aspect ratios are 4:5, 8:10. So we're going to click this top little square here with the arrows surrounding it, and that's going to bring up my cropping menu. As you can see, the aspect ratio is currently set to original, but if I click it, you get a drop down menu and you see your list of aspect ratios. So once I click that, you'll notice that the picture does crop in a little bit. Another thing to keep in mind when you're actually shooting the image, keep how you're going to crop the image in post in mind when you're taking the picture. So I wouldn't take the picture the way I would want it to be perceived on social media when I post it. You want to kind of back up just a little bit, give yourself a little wiggle room, so that way when you do go into crop, you won't run into any issues where the person's head will be chopped off or anything like that. So now that I have my cropping right, I'm going to go ahead and play with my composition. If you're familiar with the rule of thirds, you'll see these lines intersecting the picture here. We have a lot of negative space on the left-hand side, and since it's blurred out, I can actually bring this image in a little bit more to make sure that my subject is the main focus. I like to make sure with the rule of thirds, the eye line goes directly above the top row of rule of thirds, and that looks pretty good. So I'm going to click out of that and go back to my adjustment sliders, and that is going to be my final setup with my lighting before, after. I think I'm actually going to bring my highlights down just a touch. Now, the next thing that I want to do is to add a little more life to her eyes. And the way to do that is by using a brush tool. So if you look on the right hand side of these icons here, we have underneath of the crop section, there's a band-aid, and there's a little brush tool here. So I'm going to click the brush, and this is going to look very similar to my adjustment sliders up top. However, the brushes, wherever you paint over, that is the area of the image that is going to be affected. So I'm going to bring up my exposure, highlights, shadows, not too much of the white, more so the blacks, and drop down my saturation. So now with those settings in place, I'm going to zoom in and make sure that I am just above her eye, make my brush a little bit bigger. And where you see the white, we're just going to paint over that area. And that's going to bring out the white in her eye. So we drop down the saturation so that way any discoloration, any reflection that we may have in the eye is pretty much going to be canceled out by dropping the saturation, and that's going to boost the white in her eye. I'm going to hit the catch light just a little bit to whiten that and brighten that area as well. The next thing I'm going to do another paintbrush layer. And this time I'm going to adjust the color in her eye. So those steps are pretty similar to whitening the white part of the eye. However, I do want to add some color into the colored part of her eye. So again, I'm going to boost my exposure. This time the blacks and the shadows. And this time, instead of lowering my saturation, I'm going to boost my saturation just a little bit. And from there, if I eyeball the color of her eye, her eyes are kind of like a greenish tint. So I'm going to actually go to my tint section and drop that down just a little bit into the green out of the magenta section. If I zoom out by going back to my adjustment layers and look at her eyes, they really pop in this picture, and I really like the way that that looks. Now, the final step that I'm going to do, I typically do this in Photoshop, but for the demonstration purposes of this video, I'm going to show you guys how to remove minor blemishes in Lightroom as well. By hovering over this band-aid, that's going to give you the healing brush section. So we have a couple sliders that pops up, our size, feathering, and opacity. I typically leave my opacity at 100, my feathering at 100, and my size, I'm adjusting that as I go. So if I zoom in, if I make my healing brush section the size of the blemish, click on it, it's going to bring a circle over top of that blemish. Now you'll notice that we have two circles here. The area that I clicked on is being covered up from the other circle, which is the area of her skin it is sampling from. Lightroom does a pretty good job of pre-selecting the area for you, but if you click on the other circle, you can actually move that around, and you'll notice that as I move it, that area will also show up where I placed my patch. But what I want to do is make sure that I keep that area very close to that blemish so it looks as natural as possible. I hope that you all found this video helpful, and I hope that it helped anybody that wanted to touch up their images and really make them pop. I really appreciate you guys for watching, and if you found any type of value in this video, please leave it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that I can continue to do these if that is what you all would like to see. I appreciate you guys for watching. Peace.